Hi, everybody. My name is Liam Martin from Time Doctor, and I am very excited to be able to host you over the next probably 45 minutes to discuss a really interesting experiment that we implemented with one of our fantastic partners that runs a 450 seat call center in Asia. And they had a very unique problem, which was they wanted to actually figure out who was more productive, people that work in the office or people that work remotely, i.e., working from home. And I know that that's a lot of the people that are probably watching this session right now are trying to actually figure out that exact same answer to that question. And thankfully, since this organization worked with us before the pandemic, we actually have a fantastic data set before and after the COVID crisis basically changed the way remote work and work really was throughout the world. So I'm really excited about getting into it with you. If you have any questions, please just put it down in the text area. Unfortunately, since I'm doing this presentation, I got like one camera here, I've got my notes right here, I've got my second monitor over there. So I'm going to be in the notes, but if you have a question, put it down in the text section, and then I'll try to be able to get back in contact with you either right after this presentation, or if you just email support@timedoctor.com and you just reference this actual presentation and reference my name, then we will get on it immediately and we'll actually answer any questions that you might have about anything connected to what you are about to watch. And oh, by the way, this is something that we worked on for almost 6 months. So it was a really interesting data set in our perspective, and no one really has an answer to this, and I nerd out on this stuff all the time. So I hope that you guys are nerding out on this stuff as well. All right, so let's really get into it here. So fundamentally, we've got a couple things that you're going to actually learn during this presentation. You are going to understand the huge changes that remote work and hybrid work are going to be bringing to not just the general work industry, but specifically the BPO industry, because it's so easy for call center reps and other people inside of the BPO industry to be able to work remotely. It is going to completely change the way that the BPO industry works, and we're very excited to be able to review that data with you. We're also going to be talking about a data-focused approach to understanding the pros and cons of the evolving options for the future of work. This is something that, again, is really important for you to know. If you do not have this information, probably the most important work decision of your life is whether we're going to go remote, whether we're going to stay in an office, or we're going to have a hybrid work solution moving forward. So really important to be able to understand it from a data perspective. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about a specific case study of 450 agents that transitioned from on-premise to fully remote with very surprising results. They actually had to go remote in under 24 hours. The client was telling me he literally was putting computers in the back of Ubers and driving them out to different reps' locations because they quite literally had to actually flip to a remote work model during an emergency lockdown in their country. So very exciting to be able to see this data because we have such a long data set before, and we also have a significant data set after the fact. So how do we actually do all of this stuff? Well, this is something that I think is really important to be able to get into before I kind of show you the full data insights that we have collected. So we have a tool called Time Doctor, and it is a time tracking tool for remote teams. But more importantly than that, it really focuses on the analytics happening inside of your BPO. So you can break down a person, a group, the entire company. You can set up specific tags inside of your organization, and then you can compare that to another group. So for the purposes of this client, we actually had just broken down high performers versus low performers and analyzed that data longitudinally. But what we do as well is we give you actual insights into what's happening. So our machine learning algorithms allow you to be able to figure out exactly which variables of work impact significantly the outcome that you are targeting. So if you have high performers versus low performers, you could see that as an example, people that spend more time on the weekends, people that have a higher percentage in meetings, and people that spend more time on Jira in this report have a highly significant chance of being a higher performer inside of your organization. So this is exactly how we do it. If you're actually interested in a free benchmarking report, we actually provide that as well. We're going to be giving it to everybody at the end of this presentation. And also, you can just email support@timedoctor.com or type it in the chat, and we'll be able to set you up with a free, completely complimentary benchmarking report, which is going to very specifically tell you how someone is going to perform well inside of your BPO and which agents are not going to perform well inside of your BPO, with specific actionable insights that you can take to be able to either retrain your reps or generally just make them more productive. So before we get into that, I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction on myself. So I am a remote work advocate. I definitely will not kind of sugarcoat that one for you. I'm co-founder of TimeDoctor.com and Staff.com, which are both time tracking tools for remote teams. And I'm also the co-organizer of Running Remote, which is the largest conference on building and scaling remote teams. I have been working remotely for the past 15 years, and we've been running these technology companies for almost 10 years, and we've been running remote for 4 years. So we were the OGs before anyone else actually started to get into the remote work world, and we are incredibly passionate about building and scaling remote teams. Our companies have workers in over 40 different countries from around the world that work and collaborate seamlessly together. Remote work is fundamental to how we build our company, and I'm sure a lot of you have the same perspective, otherwise you wouldn't actually be here. Remote work has become obviously very hot recently, and I'm so excited about sharing this presentation with you because I truly believe remote work is going to be the way most companies operate moving forward. Also, just going to give you a certain general warning beforehand. I'm very Canadian, so if you hear a few A's throughout my presentation, I do sincerely apologize. So we're going to all be making a decision very soon, and you may have already made this decision. You may be making it in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. It's a decision to either go remote, go hybrid, or go on premise. And for those of you that don't know that different breakdown, remote is people that work obviously from home, from their computers. You have no physical office. On-premise is the old office model, meaning everyone actually works in a particular office for an extended amount of time, or you can have multiple offices. And then the third option is hybrid, which is either some employees working from home and other employees working in an office, or everyone actually having a hybridized model where maybe they only go in for meetings when they're going to really need to do a deep dive meeting. Maybe they show up to work 1 day a week to meet with their manager, and all of the other times they actually end up working from home. There's different models, there's different kind of pros and cons to each one, and we're going to be breaking that down as well. But fundamentally, this is like a new world of work. The global coronavirus pandemic completely changed the landscape of work and forced a large majority of businesses to move their operations to a remote environment. I think pretty much everyone here can relate to that. And I'd imagine some of you are still operating your businesses completely remotely. I'd love it if you can just let me know down in the chat so I can get an understanding of the breakdown. How many of you guys are working remotely? How many of you have a hybrid work relationship, and how many of you are still working from the office, i.e. an on-premise relationship? I'd really love to know, just so that we can kind of get a feel for what's happening on this call. So as all of you probably know, the move to remote, it's fundamentally not easy. There was a scramble to get the appropriate systems and processes in place. People were working from couches and kitchen counters with kids and pets crawling all over them. But over time, we settled in and got into a groove. That's when we started to see all these benefits that come from remote work. Tons of employees reported that they were getting better sleep, working out more, eating better, and just generally feeling happier in their jobs and in their lives. In fact, a recent study from Buffer found that 94% of employees who started working remotely as a result of the pandemic selected that they would like to work remotely for the rest of their career. So, here we are a year later, and things are starting to look hopeful now that we have a few promising vaccines in play. A lot of countries are going to start firing up. So the question becomes, what's next? Where do we go from here? At this point, there are basically three options: stay remote, go back to the office, or try a hybrid work model. We'll get into those details very, very soon. As far as the BPO industry goes, one of the biggest questions that everyone's trying to figure out so that they can actually make an informed decision about what's next is, can remote agents be as productive as at-home agents or in-office agents? Put another way, where are agents most effective? And this is really important because deciding how to operate moving forward is a huge decision. In reality, this could be the most important business decision in the history of your company. I think we're experiencing a tide change in work that will be even bigger than the one that the pandemic has created, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's first talk about the longitudinal study we helped run with one of our clients. The good news about the pandemic is that it gave us a ton of data to analyze that could potentially help answer this question. So we worked with one of our most innovative clients to conduct a little experiment that would give us quantitative data to help empower them, and hopefully you to make an informed decision on how to move forward. Here's how it worked. This client of ours runs a BPO in the Philippines and was forced to switch to a fully remote operation in 24 hours at the start of the pandemic a year ago. I bet you that probably sounds familiar for a lot of people. This meant that we would be able to make an apples to apples comparison of how agents performed in the office versus at home. Same company, same agents. The only thing that changed was where the agents were doing their work. We looked at a selection of 450 agents composed of both top performers and low performers and compared them over a span of 2 months in the office versus 2 months working from home. So today we want to share what we found with you and talk about how it can help you make that extremely important decision. But before we get into the findings of the experiment, I want everyone to think about some of the preconceived notions that you might have about remote work. What would you expect the data to actually show? Maybe you think that agents aren't as productive at home, or they'll slack off on social media or whatever. Those are the types of things we wanted to shed some light on, so hopefully we'll be able to address your concerns throughout the data. Just for my own interest, can you guys all throw down some ideas in the comments below? I'd love to be able to hear your perspectives on it, just to kind of see what your preconceived notions are. What are the top 3 time sucks that you think that work from home agents would actually be doing when they're working from home? While you guys work on that, here are the top concerns that we hear from BPOs that are looking at remote work. First is they're not as productive at home, and there is no accountability because they are working from home and you can't actually manage what you don't see. There's also too much time on social media, and that's going to impact their work performance. We also see many BPOs saying agents will look for other jobs or get poached when no one is actually watching what they're doing. And lastly, it will impact hours worked per week, which is definitely an interesting one, and we have some interesting data points connected to that too. Oh, and additionally, we can't monitor them when they're not on the phone, and that's fundamentally bad. And we won't be able to actually identify who needs proper training and who does not. And lastly, the customer experience will fundamentally suffer, which is why we're in business in the first place. If the customers aren't happy, then we're not actually going to be able to succeed inside of our BPOs. So first, and probably one of the most common beliefs about remote work is that agents aren't as productive when they're working from home. This is something that just seems like it has to be true. The office is for working and home is for living. So working from home has to reduce productivity, right? Okay, well, That is completely false. Actually, our experiment showed a 56% decrease in unproductive time for agents when working at home versus when working from the office. This completely flies in the face of the old school conventional wisdom that seems to make leaders and managers skeptical about remote work. We also found out that there was a statistically negligible difference between productive time when comparing in office versus remote. Effectively, remote workers are just as productive in the office and, ironically, significantly reducing unproductive work activities when they are actually working from home. Another common one is that social media use will be out of control if agents are allowed to work from home. If you had to guess, what percentage of time would you think people spend on social media at work? Post your guesses below. 5%, 10%, 20%? Well, here's some interesting data. One of the things that we noticed right away is that Facebook use is an important factor in determining performance. Share of work time spent on Facebook.com turned out to be the third most significant predictor of performance of the 86 categories that our algorithm analyzed. So basically, those who use Facebook more are less productive and vice versa. But what surprised us was that in reality, the share of time spent on Facebook was way less than anyone expected. Here we are thinking that agents were probably spending large chunks of time, like 10% on their day, on Facebook, and it turns out that even the low performers were only using Facebook 0.57% of their workday. And they turned out that by using other seemingly distracting social sites like Instagram and YouTube is less than expected as well. Instagram was only being used 0.13% of the time by low-performing employees and not at all by high-performing employees. The difference wasn't even statistically significant. YouTube was 0.54 versus 0.14% and was only somewhat significant. So what this tells us is that, yes, Facebook use is going to be higher among low-performing agents. But in the grand scheme of things, Facebook and social media use in general are actually much lower than we would think, and it probably shouldn't be a huge concern regardless of where agents are working. The thought here is we won't be able to keep an eye on agents who are working from home, so they'll spend work hours looking for other jobs or entertaining offers from recruiters trying to poach them away to other BPOs. So for this one, we looked at LinkedIn use and actually found a few interesting insights. First, it's basically a neutral data point, which means there isn't really a significant correlation between LinkedIn use and performance. What's actually more interesting is that only the lower performers were using LinkedIn, and even then, they were only spending 0.12% of their time on it. So you're actually at greater risk of losing top performers by not offering remote work because of the pandemic, want to continue for the rest of their careers. And on top of that, an OWL Lab study found that 59% of the survey respondents would be more likely to choose an employer that offered remote work over one that did not. So a majority of workers are taking the position of give me remote work or I'm just going to find someone else who will, rather than, okay, now that I'm working remotely, let me find somewhere else to go. Here's one that isn't really all that surprising. We found that agents who put in more time on the weekends are higher performers than those who don't. Not only that, but it was among one of the most statistically significant indicators of performance that we looked at. So that makes sense. More weekend hours worked, more productive. But when we looked at this through the lens of remote and hybrid work models, it opens things up to a broader discussion about flexible work and the potential value of allowing agents to work where and when they want to. If given the chance to work on the weekends without the long commute or the dress code and from the comfort of their own home, will agents ultimately be more productive? On the other hand, I think this is ultimately a cautionary insight because it reminds us to be wary of burnout. In other words, are we really interested in advocating for working more weekend hours for the sake of productivity if it comes at the expense of agent well-being and with the risk of burnout? We actually have some modeling on that at Time Doctor as well, so you can check it out at timedoctor.com. And again, if you want that productivity report, this is where we're collecting all of this data, so you can actually gain these insights as well. Maybe the most important and impactful data insight that we got from our experiment was that computer activity was hugely significant. 4 of the 13 most statistically significant indicators of performance that we looked at were related to mouse and keyboard activity. Those indicators were the average number of mouse clicks per 3-minute time period, mouse movements per 3 minutes time period, keystrokes per 3-minute time period, and the share of 3-minute chunks with no keyboard activity. So basically, agents that are less active on their mouse and keyboard are lower performers. All of that makes perfect sense, but I think the biggest takeaway from this is that the method in which you measure this type of computer activity is much more powerful than whether or not agents are working from home or in the office. This is the kind of information that you simply can't get just by looking over the shoulder of your call center reps on your office floor. It actually takes technology, and when you have these types of analytics, it doesn't matter where your agents are because you'll actually be able to pull the data and see who's meeting expectations. That way you can coach against it. Whether that's in person or remotely, you have the hard evidence of low activity rather than just a gut feeling. This is another one that seems pretty logical at the surface level, but doesn't really hold up against the numbers. For one, video calls are only a moderately significant indicator of performance at worst. We found that low performers did spend a little bit more time on Zoom than high performers at 2.72% of their time versus 1.57% of their time, but higher performers actually spent more time on Skype.com than lower performers. And the difference was insignificant when it came to the Skype app. So it's really a wash. I think the data shows us here is that video calls are just part of the job and likely don't have any more or less impact on performance than in-person meetings do. It would even be reasonable to say video calls probably have less of a negative impact on performance since you eliminate all the transitioning to meeting spaces and milling about in the halls. You probably have experienced that too, working inside of an office. Now, during this entire time, we need to actually go back to understanding our most important resource, our people. There are so many studies that are coming out about remote and hybrid work at this point, defining how employees feel about remote work and how employers feel about remote work as well. Our client had this same concern, and like many of our clients at Time Doctor, they love numbers. So they kept a longitudinal employee NPS score over a 6-month period and found employees who transitioned to remote work saw a 10% increase in eNPS. Above everything else, we find that call center agents want to be remote. They perform better remote and even like their jobs better when they work remotely. Conversely, we fear that agents will actually have an unfavorable experience when it comes to working from home as well. Whether it's just that they miss the office camaraderie or the long commutes or the dress code, I personally do not miss the long commutes at all. We seem to think that agents simply won't enjoy working from home compared to the in-office. Now, we already alluded to this a little bit earlier, so you probably know where we're headed with this, but just about all of the data on this disputes the idea that agents will dislike working from home long-term. An OWL Lab study found that employees who work from home reported being happy 22% more than those who work in an on-site office setting, and a recent FlexJobs report showed that remote workers report a higher workforce happiness index at 75 out of 100 compared to 71 for in-office employees, and number 2, remote employees are more likely to report being satisfied at their job at 57% versus 50%. Overall, those working from home reported more positive measurements on almost every question related to job satisfaction. Another one of these notions that we have about remote work is that if you can't physically see them in person, then you won't actually be able to identify which agents need training. Well, the simple fact that we are able to even gather all of this data and compare low performers to high performers gives us huge insights into who isn't performing well and why. Just like with keyboard and mouse movements, we can use technology to track all kinds of specific measurable data points that are related to productivity. So whether they're at home or in an office really makes no difference as long as you're using technology to gain the actual data-backed insights that you can filter through to see who's performing well, who's doing poorly, and why. And this tech actually goes a step further to show you exactly where training is needed. You've got all your information at your fingertips to show you what the good habits of top performers are so that you can train others to that standard. Also, a lot of people are concerned about being able to identify red flags in performance. This is actually my data that we have inside of Time Doctor, and you can see very clearly exactly where I should probably adjust. Maybe I work a little too much in comparison to the average work week, and I don't spend enough time on my CRM in comparison to other people that are in the marketing department in the company. And you can train against this stuff to actually figure out where the benchmarking data exists and where your high performers exist versus your low performers. You can provide actionable insights into their workday to be able to make them work way more efficiently. So, what do the results actually mean from this experiment for the BPO industry? Well, I think the key takeaway here is that remote work is much more viable than many of us thought. It was recently, as a year and a half ago, the pandemic forced us to face down these fears and preconceived notions that we had about remote work. Fears that were more intuitive hypothesis than experience-based. And it gave us that trial run we needed to see if perception was reality. And in the case of remote work, we found that it just wasn't. The fears we had were mostly unfounded, and that was demonstrated inside of the numbers that we presented here. Not only is remote work a viable option, but it's widely preferred, and it's highly unlikely that the remote work genie is going to go back inside of the bottle. So this is something each of us have to take into serious consideration when we're deciding what the future will look for your business. Now, back to this previous point that I was talking about, we all still have to make this decision, right? After all of this data and research and surveying and polling, you still have to actually make what is the most important business decision in the history of your company, in my opinion. So what are your actual options? Essentially, they're narrowed down to three choices. You can either stay remote and continue to strengthen your work from home processes. You can go back to the office and completely on-premise work environments, or you can opt for a hybrid model that attempts to combine the two. So let's unpack these a little bit here. Also, and I don't want to scare you guys, if you get this massively important decision right, then the transition into the future looks relatively seamless. You've picked the right model for your organizations, your agents are content, and the CX is on point, and your business thrives. But if you get this wrong, the wheels start to fall off. Some of the risks associated with not choosing the right work model are enough to derail your operations. So first off, we have the remote option. And there's pros and cons of each of these models, and we're going to go over them very, very quickly. So pro, it's significantly cheaper than the office model, and productivity is fundamentally higher. When you actually don't have to have an office, or you don't have to provide office equipment or pencils or free lunches to people, that's a significant cost. On average, the remote work model is about 30% cheaper than the on-premise model or office model, considering exactly the same salary for employees. There's also some cons. There's really lack of accountability and collaboration, and training is quite a bit harder to do inside of remote work options. If you don't have the right processes in place, fundamentally, I think a lot of these things fall apart. Even from a management perspective, it's super important to recognize what are the pros and cons of each of these approaches so that you can actually have the right systems in place to be able to make that work. The next one is the office option. And pros, accountability, collaboration, and training will be significantly easier. But the biggest con that I can see is you're actually going to lose your top people. We're already seeing this inside of the BPO industry, where if remote work is not offered as an option, it's not just an employee perk anymore, it's table stakes. So people really need to understand, hey, I can work remotely or I can work in the office. It's up to me, and I have the freedom to be able to choose where I want to go. If you don't have that option in place, it's going to create a big problem inside of your business. On the flip of that coin, it becomes really problematic if no one actually wants to come back to the office, which actually brings us to the third option, which is the hybrid option. And I'm sure most of you are thinking about the hybrid option. It's really buzzy right now that things seem to be winding down a bit with the pandemic. Basically, the concept of hybrid work is to either allow some teams to work remotely while others are in the office each day, or to have everyone split time between home and office with a system like 2 days in the office or 3 days at home, something like that. Now, remember, 40% of the businesses that we actually polled are looking to try a hybrid model. 50% said that they were going to remain remote, and 10% said that they were going to go back to an office, with 40% as hybrid. So it's a popular option, and part of the reason is that it seems like a good middle ground. The feeling is that hybrid work could be the best of both worlds, and that might actually be the case. It gives you the chance to downsize your office space and reduce overhead. You keep those that really love working from home happy, but also get to have designated time and space for in-person collaboration. And that might be the case. It gives you the chance to downsize your office space and reduce overhead. You keep those that really love working from home happy, but also get to have designated time and space for in-person collaboration, and you're still able to position yourself as offering flexible work options when recruiting talent. But what's more likely is that hybrid work is the best of none and more of a half measure than a good middle ground. Hybrid means that you don't actually get to completely eliminate your office space liabilities. You take yourself out of the fully remote talent pool, and you create an us versus them class system mentality that can be extremely toxic to your organization. At the end of the day, it's more risky to abandon remote work, even for a hybrid work model, than it is to transition to a fully remote work environment. Remember that 94% of employees who started working remotely as a result of the pandemic selected that they would like to work remotely for the rest of their career. Hybrid makes employee retention more difficult. If your top talent wants to work remotely, there are now plenty of options for them to choose from. Most of the best talent will gravitate to the fully remote roles that allow them to work from anywhere. Hybrid work breeds inequality. It can create a class system that makes those who remain remote into second-class workers, which creates animosity and can be toxic to company culture. It can generate feelings of disconnection and isolation. It makes for negative office politics and creates distance bias for promotions, mentorship, and attention. There are inherent cyber risks for any remote team, but splitting the workforce into a hybrid structure makes it more difficult to mitigate those risks. You effectively have to have on-premise security and remote security at the same time. Plus, it still leaves you with the costs associated with maintaining an office space, even if you're able to downsize. Although it can seem like a good mix of old and new, we think that hybrid is harder to get right than remote while still carrying the cons of on-premise. So our perspective is you should actually stay remote, and the data is very clear on that. You have much higher levels of employee happiness. You can actually hire internationally, so you don't have to actually hire in your city, state, or country. You can hire wherever you want, whenever you want, as long as they are good at their job and they're actually able to produce the KPIs. And you have an accountability system in place like Time Doctor in order to actually execute on it. There's a 30% cost reduction, even if you're not going to change the salaries of your different reps. And fundamentally, as we've shown here, it is producing serious increases in productivity, which to us is absolutely the option that everyone should take. More productivity equals more money equals a more productive BPO. And listen, for me, I mean, this is something that I've worked on for the past 15 years. I would probably consider myself a militant remote worker. But I got to tell you, the real core component of remote work is being able to make sure that your staff are accountable. So with that said, This is something that we do not do for everyone. We are giving away a free BPO benchmarking productivity report. It is going to tell you exactly who are the low performers inside of your organization and who are the high performers, and more importantly, what they need to do to improve their workday. So even if you don't actually end up using Time Doctor, we're providing you this report completely for free. You implement it inside of your organization, and I could guarantee you, you're going to gain some really interesting insights that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to get access to, because you have a tool like Time Doctor in place to be able to make sure that you're analyzing the productivity metrics of all of your team members. To us, it's not about how long you work, it's about what you do while you're working. And that's a really important piece for us at Time Doctor. And when we see how these huge changes inside of the BPO industry are really coming up, a tool like this is absolutely critical. So we decided to make it completely for free to be able to give people this benchmarking productivity report. So if you're interested, sign up down below, put it in the chat, email us at support@timedoctor.com. We're going to be able to actually help you out, and just mention this webinar and you're actually going to be able to get access to the free productivity report. Other than that, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm going to actually answer all of your questions down below in the text area where you have been hopefully asking me a bunch of different questions that I can answer. But other than that, I'll see you later.